Welcome to the PowerPoint lecture series on the American legal system. This is part 3 regarding sources of law. There are 3 branches of government in the United States. Does this sound familiar? I bet you talked about it in your high school social studies days. So in each of the 2 sovereigns in the United States, the federal and the state, there are 3 branches of government. Each of those 3 branches of government at both the state and federal levels creates law. Let's see if you remember what those were. Branch number 1, the legislative branch. The legislative branch consists of Congress at the federal level and the state legislatures at the state level. Congress is bicameral, that is, it has 2 houses, the Senate, and every state has 2 senators, and the House of Representatives, which is based on population. Most, but not all, states also have a bicameral legislature. If you want a fun trivia pursuit question, go ahead and look up which states have something other than a bicameral legislature. Legislatures pass 2 types of law. The far most commonly known is statutes, which are what people think of as the laws that are written down and codified into law books. Legislatures also pass private bills that address individuals' legal dilemmas. One example is a friend of mine who was born out west. He was born at home, and he was born literally at the stroke of midnight. And as it turned out, his birth certificate had one date on it as his birth date. But as he went through school and got a driver's license, they always used the other date, the date that was after midnight. When he went to get a passport, he could not get a passport because his birth certificate had a different date of birth than all of his other identification. It took a private bill of the U.S. Congress to formally declare what his birth date was so that all of his documents could be changed to legally reflect the same date, enabling him to get a passport. And that's a common example of the type of things that can be in private bills. And those private bills don't affect anyone other than the individual they're applying to. So statutes are what we usually look at for law from the legislative branch. Branch number 2, the judicial. The judicial branch consists of the courts. The judiciary creates case law, also called common law. Courts rule on the application of laws to given facts and also rule on the constitutionality of state and federal laws. Precedent, or stare decisis, is the principle that once a point of law is decided by a court, all other subsequent decisions within that court's jurisdiction should follow that point of law unless the facts are sufficiently different to warrant a different decision, or unless over time we do have new values or new statutes that are sufficient to justify overturning the prior rule. In other words, there has to be a darn good reason to overturn precedent. Otherwise, it's supposed to last and be the weighty rule of the law for quite some time. Branch number 3 is the executive branch. The executive of the U.S. government is the president, and the executive of our states are the governors. And the law written by presidents or governors are executive orders, and they have limited authority but can be quite powerful, such as President Trump has proclaimed a number of executive orders, such as changing military funding around in its budget to pay for the border wall with Mexico. However, the other aspect of the executive branch that was never anticipated by the founders of our country who wrote the Constitution was the agencies and bureaus. All of the federal and state agencies, the bureaucracy that has come to dominate our government, also pass laws in the form of agency regulations. There are far more agency regulations now than statutes or case law, and they are one of the dominant fields of law in our country. Here is a simple, very simplified example of how statutes or laws of the legislative branch and agency regulations of the executive branch and court case rulings all work together. I'll give you an example. And that is the example of myself, who am blind in one eye. And let us say that the Vermont legislature passes a statute that says no one who is blind is entitled to have a driver's license in the state of Vermont. And you, the Department of Motor Vehicles, are authorized to adopt regulations to make sure that this happens. So then the Vermont Department of Motor Vehicles passes agency regulations regarding driver's license qualifications, and those include an eye exam, and they say that people who do not pass the eye exam cannot acquire a driver's license. So let us say that I go to get my driver's license and I pass with flying colors with one eye and cannot pass the test with the other eye. And the Department of Motor Vehicles says, then you cannot have a driver's license. And I sue the Vermont Department of Motor Vehicles. I take them to court and I say, I challenge their regulation and say that exceeds the authority that the Vermont legislature gave you because I am not blind. I am not legally blind, and I passed the test in one eye, and therefore, by saying I can't have a driver's license, you have exceeded the power that the legislature gave you, and you are violating the statute that they had adopted. The judge in that court case will decide, and it'll decide a couple of things. First, was the agency reasonable? Did they afford me due process? Were they reasonable in the regulation that they adopted? And did they apply it to me fairly and without discrimination? And is that agency regulation both constitutional, and is it within the agency's powers under state statute? And ultimately, they'll look at all of that and they will issue a court case decision stating whether or not the Department of Motor Vehicles was correct and whether or not I am therefore entitled to a driver's license. That decision will then be precedent in my county, in the Superior Court of my county, unless and until other courts around the state adopt the same rule, or if I or the Department of Motor Vehicles appeals the decision to the Vermont Supreme Court, whatever the Vermont Supreme Court decides is then law regarding whether people who are partially blind can have a driver's license in Vermont or not. So that is how it works through passing the statute, which has general sweeping provisions, through the regulations that try to make it work or execute it as part of the executive branch on the ground, and then the court case that looks at one individual's facts and applies those regulations and laws to the individual facts and makes a determination. So how does that court case itself work? Well, that's going to move us on to our subsequent PowerPoint lectures where we'll take a look at the court system and what happens to a case in the course of trial and appeal.